Hi, I'm James Ryerson, and this is Line Edit, a video series about popular scholarly writing, generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. So who am I? I'm a newspaper and magazine editor. I've worked in the industry for more than 2 decades at a variety of publications. For the past 18 years, I've been an editor at the New York Times, first at the Sunday magazine, and now at the opinion pages. On each episode of Line Edit, I'll talk about my experience editing a specific piece by an academic that I've worked with. These are short pieces for wide audiences about the big questions. Today we're going to talk about an op-ed called What Emotions Are and Aren't, published in the New York Times opinion pages by the psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett. We published this piece in July of 2015. It was, I think, the second or third piece I did with Lisa in the New York Times, and she's done many pieces for me since then. If you're interested in the whole backstory for how this piece came about, you can check out my interview with Lisa on the Line Edit podcast. So in this piece, Lisa is arguing for kind of her life's work. She's someone who studies emotions and what they are. And her main argument is very counterintuitive. She says that most of us think that emotions are some kind of distinct, locatable thing in us. We think that maybe it's a bit of a circuit in our brain that makes our heart rate go a certain way and maybe gives us certain facial expression. So if you're angry, your anger neurons are activated and your heart rate goes up and you scowl. And Lisa's contention, based on a lot of work over many years in a lot of different fields, is that if you really look at the nature of emotions, if you really, when push comes to shove, you really can't find necessary and sufficient conditions for any particular emotion, and that they're much more nebulous and hard to pin down exactly what they are. She has a positive theory for what they are as well, which is a little complicated, and I won't get into it now. But the main point of this piece was really to knock down our kind of common sense intuition that there are such things as emotions in that sense. I'm going to talk about edits at really three different levels, I would say. One is a kind of big picture edit, by which I mean something that really speaks to the kind of core of how you should approach a piece like this. Then I'm going to talk about a medium-sized edit, something that really hones the substance of the argument that's being made. And then the third is a smaller point, more of a subtle tactical consideration that I think does a lot of rhetorical work in a piece like this. So the first edit I want to talk about is the big picture edit. When I say big picture, you might think I'm going to be talking about a radical restructuring of the piece, or the elimination of huge amounts of text, or rewriting the whole opening, something like that. And sometimes that is what I mean by a big picture edit. In this case, by big picture edit, I'm talking about something that's more subtle and smaller, but I think speaks to a major consideration that all writers should have when doing these kinds of short op-ed like pieces. In Lisa's original draft, she has an opening paragraph. There's nothing really wrong with that opening paragraph. You'll notice, however, in my edit that I break it into two paragraphs. I trim out a little bit of fat, maybe do a little bit of line editing. So why is that a big picture edit? I think it's because most op-eds have a kind of logical structure to the way they open. And the logical structure is something like, here is something that you all kind of know, or here's something that's going to be easy for you to understand. Here's something that's a kind of nice entry point into the piece. The second beat is something like, I'm introducing now a complexity into that first beat. I'm introducing a complication or a surprise or wrinkle, something that's going to start to get this piece going. And then the third kind of beat in this logical structure is some indication of how that is going to be resolved or where you're going to go with that tension. That logical structure is, I think, so key to why these pieces are effective when reaching a lot of different readers. What you often have to remember is you've got readers who are coming to this piece from the food section where they've just read about a mojito recipe, or they're coming to it from the foreign section where they've just read about a genocide in Darfur. All of a sudden, they're reading about the nature of emotions. You have to remember, they're not primed for this. They don't really know what this piece is about. The headline and the subhead has given them a little bit of indication, but you want to bring them in slowly. Then you want to quickly say that there's something complicated or interesting about it, and then you want to indicate where that's going to start to go, how that's going to be resolved, or what the payoff is. Lisa basically has those three beats in her first structure. So, in some sense, what I'm doing here is aesthetic and arbitrary. I'm making the paragraphs smaller and I'm cleaning them up a little bit. And on the other hand, you can see this is actually a pretty fundamental change to the piece, because what I'm saying is here is the logical structure. I think a reader looking at this piece will very quickly feel in the first couple sentences that they understand what she's talking about. The next paragraph, they're going to feel like, whoa, she's starting to complicate things for me a little bit. And by the end of that paragraph, you're going to feel like she's proposed a question that's really tantalizing and is leading you into the rest of the piece. Just to academics and scholars looking to do popular writing, whether for newspapers, magazines, or maybe a website or something like that, even if you're happy with the basic paragraph that you have, I would consider looking for chances to break them up and say, how short can these paragraphs be? Can we have 2-sentence paragraphs, 3-sentence paragraphs instead of 7 or 8-sentence paragraphs? And I think what you'll find as you do that is that what you're really asking of the reader, the basic moves you're trying to make, become clearer and clearer. And I think that allows you both to cut material that's extraneous, and it also actually gives you opportunities from time to add a little bit more detail, because you're giving each beat its own space. And sometimes that's an opportunity to actually flesh out each beat rather than having them kind of rush through too quickly in a single paragraph. So I would say the general lesson to draw here is that paragraphs are really the beating heart of the op-ed. That is the kind of meaningful, logical unit. And the more you can try to play around with that in your writing, I think the more you'll find that you're doing other things. Once you start making those paragraph breaks, you'll find that you're doing other things to the piece that all work in the service of an effective op-ed. The second edit I want to talk about on this piece here is more of a mid-sized edit. In Lisa's first draft, the first sentence of her second paragraph is, "A similar situation exists in the science of emotion." Now, what is she talking about? In the paragraph above, she's explained this sort of thought experiment that if you listen to a stereo with the speakers positioned just right, it can sound like the orchestra is in your head. And that if you were to trust your senses and believe that the orchestra is in your head, you would ask questions like, where are the woodwinds located? Or where are the trombones located? And her general point is, that is clearly not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, how does your brain generate this illusion? This is the thought experiment that she opens the piece with, and she wants to pivot to the fact that this is true in a different context. And she says, a similar situation exists in the science of emotion. The edit I proposed is to change that sentence to read in the following way. It reads, I have just set the stage to dispel a major misconception about emotions. Now, why did I make that change? There are two reasons. One is that the original sentence, a similar situation exists in the science of emotion, is a little flat. It says, I've just described one situation, and you might see something similar here in this other context. By saying, I have just set the stage to dispel a major misconception, she's really now signaling, I'm going to make a really radical argument here, which is what she's doing in the piece. So that edit is really motivated by an attempt to signal to the reader just how ambitious her argument is. The second reason I did it is because the sentence reads, a similar situation exists in the science of emotion. That makes it sound like Lisa's making a claim of interest to people who study emotions. Her argument is much bigger than that. She's telling us that emotions are not what we think they are. Even you and me just thinking about our own emotions, they're not what they think they are. By changing it to, I have just set the stage to dispel a major misconception about emotions, as opposed to a major misconception in the science of emotions, we've just broadened the scale of this piece so that the reader is told, it doesn't matter whether you're a scientist, this piece about scientists is going to speak to your experiences as a human. The larger lesson here, I suppose, is go big or go home. And what I mean by that is not really that you have to go big in every single op-ed piece, that you always have to try to overturn our entire way of looking at things in every op-ed piece. That's obviously not the case. But what I mean is when you are making a big argument, you got to signal that. You got to explain to the reader that you're about to do something big. And so that's the second edit here. The third edit is a smaller scale edit. It follows on the kind of second edit that we just talked about. And that's in the very first sentence of the next paragraph. In the published version of the piece, Lisa concedes, of course, we experience anger, happiness, surprise, and other emotions as clear and identifiable states of being. She says,
Of course, in our daily lives, we all feel things like anger, happiness, surprise. In the original draft, there wasn't anything that quite resembled that type of concession. Why was it important to introduce a sentence like this in the piece? On the one hand, it seems like a small sentence, and it seems like precisely because she's saying, of course, it's really something that you might think of as optional in the piece. It's something we all know, so why does Lisa have to introduce it? The reason she has to introduce it is anytime you make a really radical argument, especially one like this that suggests that you don't have emotions of the sort that every day you experience yourself to be having, when you make an argument that's that radical, it's very easy for a reader to dismiss you. Remember, you're not at an academic conference. You're not producing this paper in a journal with all the citations and everything. You're really making a compressed version of this argument for a very wide readership. And most people who are not presented with all the studies and everything else that goes along with a proper scientific article or a proper conference presentation, they're just going to say, I'm sure there's a scientist who doesn't believe this, so I'm just going to disregard it. They're just going to think it sounds the opposite of too good to be true. It just sounds too radical to be really worth taking seriously, and they might think something like, God, these academics, they have so many incentives to think wild and novel and challenging thoughts. That's just what they're paid to do. So this is another scientist kind of making an argument that's maybe just a little out there. But as soon as Lisa says, look, I'm with you, I know that what I just said sounds pretty nuts, she's immediately regained whatever trust she might have begun to lose. So I think the general lesson here is don't forget your readers. And what I mean by that is always try to keep in mind, if you're making a really strong argument, that by conceding something, either to the other side or to someone's intuition, you're actually making your argument stronger. It's not like you're giving up a point. You're actually gaining a point. I often find this to be the case with academics writing op-eds, but quite frankly with anyone writing an op-ed, is that they think that because they're writing a short op-ed, their job is to just make their argument as powerfully as they possibly can. Don't give an inch, no quarter, no concessions. They think that's the genre we're looking for. We're not really looking to do that. The op-ed is also a kind of rhetorical performance. So you want to be making the best argument you can, but by conceding points to the other side, by showing that you understand where they're coming from, you regain the trust of a lot of readers, and you're more likely both to get them to finish the piece, but also to get them to think, okay, I'm in good hands here. I'm here with someone who understands how I'm feeling about this argument, even as it's challenging me.
Thanks again for joining us for Line Edit. We are very grateful to the public engagement team at the John Templeton Foundation who made this project and its associated podcasts possible. Thanks as well to Professor Dave DeSteno at Northeastern University. Northeastern administers our grant. And of course, we couldn't have done this without the generosity of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who graciously allowed us to look under the microscope at her first draft, as well as the final product. This video was hosted and produced by me, James Ryerson, and produced and edited by Joseph Friedman. Happy writing.